Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the strangest status symbol humanity ever invented. The colour of your own skin. That's right. For most of history, the exact same suntan that today cost you $40 at a salon would have gotten you labelled a filthy peasant, sorted somewhere socially between the goats and the turnips. We're talking about tanning, the great back and forth obsession that had the rich avoiding the sun like it owed them money, then chasing it like it was handing out free real estate, then sprinting away from it all over again the moment a doctor muttered the word melanoma. Before we begin, a heartfelt thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic. The comment section is where most of my best ideas come from, and frankly, half of you have better taste than I do. So if you enjoy what I do here, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually want to. No pressure whatsoever. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because somehow it's always 2 a.m. for somebody. And if you'd rather drift off with just your ears, the channel is now on Spotify as well. There's a link waiting patiently in the description. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft white noise, get comfortable, and maybe pull the blanket up over the shoulders the sun is no longer allowed to touch. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered why your great-great-grandmother would have fainted at the sight of a beach holiday? Why fashionable women once ate actual poison to look more like a corpse? Why a tan could mark you as either the lowest worker in the village or the richest woman at the party, depending entirely on which century you happen to be born in? Have you ever wondered who decided pale was beautiful, then changed their mind, then changed it right back, all while selling you something at every single step? And now, congratulations. You've just woken up in a world where the sun is the enemy. Your skin is to be guarded, shaded, bonneted and gloved at all costs, because out here a single freckle can sink a reputation. Welcome to the long, ridiculous war between people and a giant ball of light. Good luck keeping up. Let's start with the simplest truth in the whole story, the one that explains everything that follows. For almost all of human history, a tan was bad news. Not edgy, not athletic, not you look great, did you go away? Bad news. Because if your skin was browned and weathered, it meant one thing to everyone who saw you. You worked outside in the dirt under the open sky like an animal that had been given a hoe. Pale skin, on the other hand, whispered the most desirable thing a person could possibly say without speaking. I do not labour. Somebody else does it for me. For thousands of years, across wildly different cultures, the message stayed weirdly consistent. The lighter and more untouched your skin, the further you were from sweating in a field and the closer you were to power, leisure, and lunch you didn't have to grow yourself. Think about how strange that is for a moment. We tend to assume beauty standards are about beauty, about what genuinely pleases the eye. But this one was never about looks at all. It was a status report written directly onto your body, updated daily, impossible to hide. Your skin told the world your job, your class, and your future before you ever opened your mouth. A merchant could lie about his wealth, a peasant could borrow a finer cloak, but neither of them could fake a complexion that had spent its whole life in the shade. The sun was an honest, brutal accountant, and it kept everyone's books in public. And here's the part that makes it genuinely funny when you zoom out far enough. We like to imagine our ancestors as practical people, focused on survival, too busy fighting plagues and bad harvests to fuss over appearances. Yet the moment anyone had 2 coins to rub together, the first thing they did was start judging each other by skin tone in the most arbitrary way imaginable. It's a bit like a group of people surviving a shipwreck on a desert island and immediately forming opinions about whose driftwood furniture is tackier. The need to sort ourselves into better than you and worse than you appears to be older, stronger, and far more durable than almost anything else we do. You can picture the whole arrangement playing out in any village across the centuries. The lord rides past on his horse, pale as a candle, hands soft, face untouched by weather, and everyone understands instantly that this is a person of importance. Behind him trudge the field workers, brown as saddle leather, lined and squinting, and everyone understands that just as instantly. Nobody had to explain the code. Nobody printed it on a sign. It was simply absorbed, generation after generation, until pale skin and high birth felt as naturally linked as thunder and rain. The sun didn't just tan you, it sorted you. So that is our starting line, the rule that ruled the world for longer than almost any other beauty standard in history. Pale was power, brown was burden, and the gap between them was measured in sunlight. Hold on to that idea, because everything that comes next is just humanity slowly, stubbornly, and somewhat hilariously rearranging the furniture in that same small room. The players change, the centuries roll by, the poisons get more creative, but the underlying game stays exactly the same. And to see where it truly began, we need to travel back to one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, where the sun was worshipped as a god and quietly feared as a critic. Travel back to the banks of the Nile, where the sun is less a gentle companion and more a daily interrogation lamp, and you'll find one of the earliest hints that skin colour carried meaning. Look at the painted walls of Egyptian tombs, and you'll notice something curious. The men are usually rendered in a deep reddish brown, while the women are painted noticeably paler in soft yellows and creams. Some of this was pure artistic shorthand, a visual code for who belonged where. Men were shown as outdoor beings, baked by the work of the world, while elite women were shown as indoor creatures, shielded and shaded and very much not out hauling grain. Either way, the pattern is already forming thousands of years ago, etched in mineral paint. The sun touches the labourer, and the lady stays in the shade. Now, before you imagine ancient Egyptian women cowering indoors like vampires waiting for sunset, it's worth being fair to them. Egypt was a society obsessed with grooming, and that obsession ran across every class and every gender. People oiled their skin against the relentless dry heat, lined their eyes with thick black kohl, and treated personal care as something close to a sacred duty. Cleanliness and presentation were tangled up with religion and respectability, so this wasn't vanity for vanity's sake. It was closer to a full-body maintenance routine performed in a climate that wanted nothing more than to crack you like an old riverbed. If you've ever stepped off a plane into desert heat and felt your skin instantly turn to parchment, you have a small taste of what they were managing every single day. But underneath all that practical care sat that same quiet, social signal we already met in the village. The convention of painting noble women pale wasn't random. It gently reinforced the idea that a woman of status didn't spend her days roasting in a field. Her world was meant to be the cool interior of a home, the shaded courtyard, the curtained room. Her paleness, real or artistically exaggerated, was a tiny visual flag for leisure and protection. A sun-darkened woman, by contrast, was clearly someone whose survival depended on labour out in the open. The sun, even in a land that literally worshipped it as the god Ra, was still busy sorting people into categories the moment it touched their skin. It's a wonderful little contradiction when you sit with it. Here was a civilization that built temples to the sun, that timed its entire calendar to the sun, that believed the sun was reborn every single morning in an act of cosmic triumph, and yet the elite still preferred their women to look as though that magnificent deity had never once landed on their cheeks. It's a bit like deeply admiring a celebrity while taking great care never to be photographed standing next to them. Reverence and avoidance, all at once. So even at the dawn of recorded beauty, the rule we started with is already humming away beneath the surface, dressed up in linen and lined with coal. Skin tone was never neutral. It was a message, painted onto tomb walls so that even the dead carried their social rank into eternity in the colour of their limbs. The sun was God and judge in the same breath, and as we sail north and west across the Mediterranean into the marble world of ancient Greece, we'll watch that judgment harden into something far more deliberate, far more chemical, and considerably more dangerous than a little artistic license with the paintbrush. Now drift across the Mediterranean to ancient Greece, where respectable women were expected to spend most of their lives indoors, tucked away in the home like a particularly expensive vase. The result, conveniently enough, was skin that stayed pale, smooth, and untouched by the brutal Aegean sun. And pale skin became the gold standard of feminine beauty. The problem was that not every woman was naturally moonbeam-coloured, and so the cosmetics industry of the ancient world rolled up its sleeves. The favoured solution was a white powder made from lead, applied to the face to fake that luminous, never-seen daylight glow. It worked beautifully, right up until you remember it was lead, slowly poisoning the very women trying to look their best. It's like inventing a face cream out of something you'd later find behind a hazardous material sign. The indoor life of the respectable Greek woman wasn't a casual preference. It was practically a social contract. The household was her domain. The public square belonged to men, and the further a woman's world extended from the sunlit outdoors, the more honourable her family appeared. So pale skin became a happy byproduct of being kept, sheltered, and shaded, which meant it doubled as proof of a certain kind of protected, respectable status. A tanned woman might be a slave, a field worker, or someone forced by poverty to earn her keep under the open sky. A pale woman, glowing softly indoors, signalled a family with the means to keep her there. Her complexion was, in effect, a financial statement she wore on her face. When nature failed to deliver the required pallor, the white lead powder stepped in. It went by the name Cymithian, and it was prized precisely because it was so opaque, so smooth, so convincingly pale, that it could turn any complexion into the desired alabaster. Imagine sitting at a small bronze mirror, dabbing this fine white powder across your cheeks, genuinely delighted at how flawless and fashionable you look, with absolutely no idea that you're gently introducing a heavy metal into your body, one beauty session at a time. The ancient world had no warning labels, no clinical trials, no concerned articles to read at 2 a.m. There was only the powder, the mirror, and the comforting certainty that you looked exactly as a woman of good standing should. The cruelty of it, of course, is that lead doesn't politely leave once it's done flattering you. Prolonged use damages the skin it sits on, which encourages heavier application to cover the damage, which causes more damage, in a tidy little spiral of self-destruction dressed as self-improvement. It's the original version of a problem we'll meet again and again on this journey. The very product sold to make you beautiful quietly, working to make you anything but. The Greeks weren't foolish. They were simply trapped inside the limits of what they knew, chasing an ideal with the only tools available, none of which came with a poison warning. And so the pattern deepens. In Greece, pale skin wasn't just admired, it was manufactured, at real cost to the women who pursued it. Beauty had become an active project, something you built with powder and protected with walls, rather than something you simply were. The sun remained the enemy, the indoors remained the fortress, and the price of admission to the ideal was measured in slow, invisible harm. Hold that thought tightly, because just across the sea, the Romans were watching, taking notes, and preparing to do what Rome always did with a Greek idea, take it, expand it, and somehow make it even more alarming. The Romans, never a people to leave a good idea unborrowed, took the Greek obsession with pallor and ran straight off a cliff with it. Wealthy Roman women coated their skin in white lead as well, chasing the same untouched indoor luminosity, and they didn't stop there. Recipes from the era describe a parade of substances slathered onto the face in the name of beauty, some merely strange, some genuinely alarming, and at least one involving crocodile droppings, which I sincerely hope smelled better than it sounds. The point was always the same: lighten, brighten, and above all look nothing like the sun-scorched farmhands working the fields beyond the city walls. To be pale in Rome was to announce without saying a word that your hardest daily task was deciding which couch to recline on at dinner. Roman beauty was a serious, well-documented enterprise. The poet Ovid even wrote about cosmetics and face treatments, describing concoctions blended from ingredients like ground beans, crushed petals, honey, and various other pastes meant to smooth and whiten the complexion. Picture a Roman lady's morning, attended by enslaved women whose entire job was to apply these mixtures, layer the white lead, redden the lips and cheeks, and transform a perfectly ordinary face into the fashionable ideal. It was a daily ritual of remarkable effort, all aimed at producing a single impression that this was a woman so wealthy, so removed from labour, that the sun had simply never been granted access to her. The substances involved ranged from the merely odd to the genuinely hazardous. Chalk could lighten the skin harmlessly enough, but the truly prized whitening still came from lead, with all its slow and terrible consequences faithfully reproduced across another great civilization. And then there were the truly baffling entries in the beauty manual, the animal-derived pastes and exotic imports that sound less like skincare and more like a dare. When you read that some recipes called for crocodile dung as a cosmetic ingredient, you have to admire the sheer commitment, the willingness to smear something genuinely unpleasant across your face on the theory that it might leave you glowing. It makes the modern world's strangest beauty fads look almost timid by comparison. What's striking is how recognizable the whole scene feels despite the centuries. Strip away the togas and the marble, and you have a thriving beauty economy, products promising transformation, experts dispensing advice, social pressure driving demand, and a steady undercurrent of risk that everyone politely ignored. The Roman woman at her cosmetics table, surrounded by little pots and jars, layering on her pale perfection, is not so different from anyone who has ever stood in front of a bathroom mirror, believing that the next product will finally deliver the look. The technology changed. The yearning and the willingness to pay for it in coin and in health did not, and so the ancient world hands the obsession forward, intact and undimmed. Pale skin meant leisure, leisure meant wealth, and wealth meant you'd won at the only game that mattered. The lead kept poisoning, the strange pastes kept selling, and the sun kept getting blamed for ruining a perfectly good complexion. When Rome eventually crumbled and Europe slid into the long, hard centuries we call the Middle Ages, you might expect this fussy, elaborate beauty culture to vanish, along with the aqueducts and the bathhouses. It didn't. The obsession with pale skin survived the fall of empires, settled into the feudal world, and there it grew sharper, harsher, and more rigidly tied to class than ever before. Now we land in medieval Europe, where the rules hardened into something close to law. In a world of lords and serfs, your skin was practically a uniform. Peasants worked the land from sunrise to sunset, and the sun repaid them with leathery, browned, weather-beaten faces that announced their station to anyone within squinting distance. Nobles, meanwhile, made it their full-time mission to look as though daylight had never been formally introduced to them. Fair skin meant you were spared the fields, spared the toil, and spared the indignity of honest sweat. To a medieval mind, a tan wasn't a sign you'd been somewhere nice. It was proof you'd been bent double pulling turnips for somebody who owned you. Beauty and idleness had quietly fused into the very same thing. Medieval society was rigid in a way that's almost hard to grasp today. You were born into your place, you stayed in your place, and your place was visible in nearly everything about you. Your clothes, your diet, your hands, and yes, your skin. There was very little climbing the ladder, mostly because there wasn't really a ladder, just a series of fixed boxes that you spent your whole life inside. In that frozen world, a pale complexion became one more marker, locking the classes apart. The lord's daughter and the miller's daughter might both have been young, both have been pretty, but only one of them glowed with the untouched fairness that whispered nobility, and everyone knew at a glance which was which. Fair skin even got tangled up with virtue, which is where things get especially interesting. In the medieval imagination, paleness wasn't only fashionable, it was somehow purer, more refined, more spiritually elevated. The idealized noble lady of poems and paintings was always luminously fair, as though her unblemished skin were evidence of an unblemished soul. A sun-darkened labourer, by contrast, was earthy, common, and worldly in the least flattering sense. So a tan didn't just say poor, it quietly implied lesser in nearly every way that mattered to a society obsessed with rank and salvation. That's an enormous amount of meaning to hang on a little sunshine. The practical reality behind all this, of course, was relentless outdoor toil. A peasant didn't get tanned on holiday. A peasant got tanned because the alternative was starving. Hours under the open sky, bent over crops, hauling water, herding animals, repairing roofs, all of it stamped its mark into the skin year after year. There was no shade to retreat to and no choice in the matter. The very sun that branded them as low-born was also the sun their survival depended on, which is a special kind of unfairness when you think about it. They were judged for the exact thing that kept them and everyone above them fed. Meanwhile, up in the manor, the goal was the precise opposite, and an entire lifestyle was arranged to achieve it. Staying pale required staying inside, staying covered, and treating the outdoors as something to be crossed quickly rather than enjoyed. It was leisure made visible, privilege you could see from across a field. The medieval world had taken the ancient obsession with pale skin and welded it firmly to the iron framework of class, until your complexion became a near-permanent label of who you were and who you would always be. And for the noble women determined to protect that precious, status-defining fairness, ordinary avoidance was never quite enough. Keeping the sun off your skin in a world without sunscreen, without easy shade, without any of our modern conveniences, demanded a daily strategy as elaborate as it was exhausting. Imagine you're a high-born woman in this world, and your single most precious asset, more valuable than wit or kindness, is skin that has never met a sunbeam. Protecting it becomes a daily campaign waged with the seriousness of a military siege. You drape yourself in veils, tuck your hands into gloves, and pull wide hats and hoods low over your face whenever you must venture outdoors, which is as rarely as humanly possible. A parasol becomes less a fashion accessory and more a portable shield against social ruin. Every shaded path, every covered walkway, every curtained litter exists to keep that one ray of sun from landing on your cheek. Out there, the sky is not beautiful. The sky is a threat, and your whole life is spent politely hiding from it. Picture the layers involved. Long sleeves down to the wrists, high necklines, fabric covering nearly every inch of skin, topped with a wimple or veil framing the face, and a broad hat or hood over that. In the summer heat, this was less an outfit and more a personal greenhouse. trapping warmth and sweat against the body in the name of keeping the sun out. You weren't dressing for comfort, you were dressing for war, and the enemy was the same enemy your grandmother had fought and her grandmother before her. Every morning you armoured up against daylight itself, then went about your day quietly cooking inside your own clothes, all so that nobody could ever accuse your skin of having seen the sky. Movement was a careful art. A noble woman didn't simply stroll across a sunny courtyard. She planned her route through the shade like a soldier crossing open ground under fire. She travelled in covered carriages and curtained litters, precisely so that the journey from one shaded interior to another wouldn't expose her to a single careless ray. Indoor life wasn't a hardship to be endured, but a fortress to be cherished. The cool, dim rooms of the manor serving as her natural habitat. The garden was lovely, certainly, but to be enjoyed from a shaded seat, beneath a parasol held by a servant, never out in the merciless open where freckles and worse might form. And here is the genuinely funny part, the irony that runs through this whole grim ritual. All of this effort, all this sweating and shading and careful dodging of sunlight was performed in pursuit of looking effortless. The entire point of pale skin was to suggest a life of ease, of leisure, of never having to strain or labour. Yet achieving that look of carefree idleness took a daily regimen of discipline, planning, and physical discomfort that would put a modern fitness routine to shame. The noble woman worked remarkably hard to appear as though she had never worked at all. It's a contradiction so perfect it could be its own little parable, the exhausting labour of seeming to do nothing. So the medieval lady spent her years in a strange sealed bubble, treating the sun as a lifelong adversary and her own complexion as territory to be defended at all costs. It was uncomfortable, it was relentless, and it was completely successful at communicating exactly what it was meant to communicate. I am important, I am protected, and I do not toil. But avoidance, however devoted, can only do so much. The sun is persistent, life happens, and sometimes a freckle simply appears anyway. And when prevention failed, when a complexion needed not just guarding but correcting, women reached for the recipes and remedies of their day, a collection of homemade treatments that range from the charmingly harmless to the genuinely horrifying. Of course, simply hiding from the sun was never quite enough, because beauty has always demanded that we improve on what we hide. So generations of women turned to homemade and apothecary concoctions designed to bleach, brighten, and erase any hint of colour the sun had managed to sneak in. Some of these were harmless enough, gentle things like crushed flowers, egg whites, or a dab of vinegar. Others were absolute nightmares dressed up as skincare, leaning once again on lead, mercury, and other ingredients that read today like a coroner's shopping list. The cruel joke baked into the whole enterprise is that the harder a woman worked to look pale and pure, the more she risked poisoning herself in the process. Beauty was a slow toll, and an awful lot of people paid it without ever knowing the price. The gentler end of the spectrum is almost endearing in its hopefulness. Women ground up almonds, mixed honey with various oils, soaked bread in milk, dabbed rose water across their skin, and applied the juices of plants believed to lighten and soften. There's something genuinely sweet about it, a kitchen table optimism, the belief that the right mixture of pantry ingredients might just unlock flawless beauty. Many of these recipes did little harm and occasionally even a little good, soothing or moisturizing the skin without poisoning anyone. If the whole story had stayed in this gentle territory, it would be a charming footnote about resourceful women and their homemade lotions. But the story, predictably, did not stay gentle, because the most effective whiteners, the ones that truly delivered that dramatic, opaque, fashionable pallor, kept coming back to the heavy metals. Lead and mercury were prized precisely because they worked so visibly, smoothing the complexion and brightening it in ways no almond paste ever could. Mercury-based preparations could even peel away the top layers of skin, leaving a temporarily fresh, pale surface beneath, which felt like a miracle right up until you realized the miracle was your face slowly disintegrating. These weren't fringe products used by a reckless few. They were mainstream tools of the beauty trade, passed along, recommended, and trusted by people who had no way of knowing what they were really doing to themselves. And there was no system to protect anyone from any of it. There were no ingredient lists, no regulators, no scientists publishing alarming findings, no neighbour warning you that the lovely complexion cream was quietly attacking your nervous system. A woman might use these preparations faithfully for years, watching her skin and health decline, never once connecting the cause to the cure. The damage crept in so gradually, so invisibly, that it could easily be blamed on age, on illness, on bad luck, on anything except the little pot of whitening paste on the dressing table. Ignorance wasn't a personal failing. It was simply the condition of the entire era. You used what was available and trusted what everyone trusted. This is the deep, recurring tragedy threaded through the whole history of pale beauty. And it's worth pausing on before we go further. Again and again, the pursuit of an ideal complexion turned the pursuit itself into a hazard. The women weren't vain fools. They were ordinary people responding rationally to powerful social pressure, using the best tools they had in a world that gave them no warning of the danger. They wanted to be admired, to be respectable, to meet the standard their society demanded, and the cost of meeting it was hidden inside the very products that promised success. And nowhere did this dark bargain play out more famously, more publicly, or with more lasting consequence than on the painted face of one of the most powerful women England ever knew. No one in history committed to the pale aesthetic harder than Queen Elizabeth I of England, whose face became the most famous shade of white on the continent. After surviving smallpox left her skin scarred, she leaned into a thick cosmetic paste of white lead and vinegar, building an almost porcelain mask that radiated power, virtue, and untouchable royalty. The look was so admired that the entire court scrambled to copy it, painting themselves into matching ghosts. The trouble, predictably, was the lead, which over years of devoted application is thought to have eaten away at the very skin it was meant to flatter, demanding ever thicker layers to cover the damage it had caused. It was a beauty routine that destroyed the canvas and then sold you more paint, and a queen wore it like a crown. The substance she favoured had a name that sounds almost elegant until you learn what's in it. Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar prized for producing the smoothest, palest, most flawless finish available. On Elizabeth, this wasn't merely fashion, it was statecraft. Her pale, luminous, almost otherworldly face projected an image of a near-divine ruler, untouchable and eternal, a monarch who seemed to float above the ordinary concerns of mortal skin. In an age when a queen's image carried enormous political weight, that radiant white mask was a tool of power, a carefully constructed symbol, broadcast through every portrait and public appearance. She wasn't just covering her smallpox scars, she was building a legend. But the legend came at a steep and steady cost. Lead, as we've established with grim repetition, does not flatter you for free. Applied day after day, year after year in ever thicker coats, it is believed to have worsened the very complexion it concealed, irritating and damaging the skin so that more paste was needed to hide the deterioration, which in turn caused further deterioration. It's the beauty trap in its purest, most royal form, a closed loop of harm and correction with no exit. The mask that made her magnificent was, in the same breath, slowly working against her. And the more she relied on it, the more she needed it. and the whole court naturally lined up to do exactly the same thing. When the most powerful woman in the realm establishes a look, the fashionable rush to imitate it, and so the lords and ladies of Elizabethan England painted themselves into the same pale perfection, layering on the same toxic ceruse, chasing the same untouchable glow. The royal court became a gallery of beautiful, dangerous masks, an entire social elite voluntarily applying poison to their faces because the Queen had made it the height of style. It's a vivid lesson in how beauty standards spread, not through reason but through power and aspiration, trickling down from the top until everyone who matters is doing the identical risky thing and calling it taste. What makes Elizabeth's storyland so hard is that she was no naive victim of fashion. She was one of the shrewdest, most calculating rulers of her age, a woman who understood image and symbolism better than almost anyone alive. And even she was caught in the same trap as the lowliest noblewoman with her pot of whitening cream, because the trap wasn't about intelligence, it was about the limits of what anyone could know. The pale ideal demanded lead, and lead demanded a price, and there was no escaping that equation in her century, not even from a throne. Yet for all the danger hidden in the powder, some seekers of pallor weren't content to merely paint themselves pale. A few were willing to go further, much further, and reach for a method of achieving that delicate, drained, fashionable look that bordered on the genuinely self-destructive. Here's where the pursuit of pallor crosses from merely toxic into genuinely unhinged. For those determined to look delicate, fragile, and utterly drained of any rude, healthy, sun-warmed colour, there was an option beyond powder and parasols: bloodletting. Yes, some people had themselves bled deliberately, in part to achieve that fashionably wan, washed out, faintly about to collapse appearance that signalled refinement. The pale, sickly look wasn't an accident to be cured, it was an aesthetic to be chased. Looking robust and rosy suggested you ate well and worked hard outdoors, which was hopelessly common. Looking like you might gently swoon onto a fainting couch at any moment, by contrast, was elegant. It's a stunning thing to sit with. There was a time when looking healthy was the unfashionable problem, and weakness was the goal. To be fair, bloodletting had a long and serious career as actual medicine, rooted in the ancient theory that the body held 4 humours that needed to be kept in balance, and that draining a bit of blood could correct all manner of ailments. Doctors prescribed it for fevers, for headaches, for nearly everything, with a confidence entirely unsupported by results. So the practice was already woven into the fabric of life, a normal thing to have done to you by a physician, or a barber surgeon wielding a blade or a cup of leeches. It wasn't a strange fringe activity. It was respectable, mainstream, and widely trusted, which is precisely what made it so easy to drift from treating illness into chasing an appearance. Because a useful side effect of being drained of blood is that you turn pale, weak, and listless, the exact qualities the fashionable ideal demanded. A fresh-faced, energetic complexion was the look of a peasant who laboured and ate heartily. A pallid, languid, delicate one was the look of a refined aristocrat too sensitive and elevated for such coarse vitality. So the wan, faint, slightly unwell appearance became aspirational, a visible sign that you belong to a higher, more rarefied class of being. And if your natural good health insisted on showing through, well, there were ways to take the edge off, to soften that vulgar bloom into something more becomingly fragile. When you line it up against modern life, the absurdity really shines. Today we spend fortunes and hours trying to look vibrant, energetic, and glowing with health. We take supplements, chase a flush of colour, and panic at the first sign of looking tired or drawn. The fashionable ideal of these earlier centuries was in many ways the precise opposite. They wanted the tired, drawn, drained look on purpose. They aspired to appear as though a strong breeze might knock them over. It's as if an entire culture decided that the goal of beauty was to seem perpetually 3 days into a bad flu, and then worked diligently to achieve it. But strip away the strangeness, and the same old engine is still turning underneath. The wan, bloodless look was desirable for exactly one reason. It was the look of someone who didn't have to be strong, who didn't have to work, who could afford to be delicate. Fragility was a luxury, a way of showing that survival had never required toughness from you. Once again, the beauty standard wasn't about what looked good in any neutral sense. It was about advertising a life removed from labour, this time taken to the eerie extreme of cultivating the appearance of illness itself. The obsession with pallor had become so total that people were willing to undermine their own vitality to display it. And as we step into the powdered, perfumed, gloriously excessive 1700s, we'll see that willingness to suffer for the ideal reach a new and deadly peak, complete with a famous tragedy that should have served as a warning to everyone. Roll forward to the 1700s, the age of powdered wigs, beauty patches, and faces caked in lead-based makeup so heavy it practically qualified as a second skull. Fashionable men and women alike whitened their complexions to dramatic, theatrical extremes, and the era produced one of history's most haunting cautionary tales. A celebrated society beauty named Maria Gunning, who became the Countess of Coventry, was famous across Europe for her looks and devoted to her cosmetics, refusing to give up her lead-based makeup even as it ruined her. She died in the 1760s, still a young woman, in a death widely blamed on the very products that had made her glow. She was, in the grimmest possible sense, dying to look beautiful, and she was very far from the only one. The Georgian era took cosmetic excess to a height that makes earlier centuries look restrained. This was a world of towering powdered wigs, of rouged cheeks, of skin painted a stark, dramatic white, and dotted with little black patches placed just so. The fashionable face was less a natural feature, and more a constructed work of art, layered and decorated and maintained with enormous effort. And underneath that elaborate spectacle, the foundation of it all remained the same poisonous white lead that had been quietly harming people since antiquity, now applied more thickly and more universally than ever, by men and women both, in pursuit of an ideal that grew more extreme with each passing season. Maria Gunning's story sits at the dark heart of all this, and it's worth telling plainly because it captures the entire tragedy in a single life. She and her sister arrived in fashionable society as legendary beauties, drawing crowds simply by appearing in public, and Maria's marriage made her a countess and a celebrity of her age. She was, by every account, breathtaking, and she was utterly devoted to her cosmetics, to the white lead paint that maintained her famous complexion, reportedly continuing to use it even as her health visibly failed, and even as her own husband is said to have despaired of the stuff. She would not give up the look that had made her who she was, and the look in the end took her life while she was still young. There's something almost unbearably modern about her refusal. We like to think we'd know better, that if a product were visibly harming us we'd simply stop using it. But the pull of an established beauty standard is far stronger than logic. Maria had built her entire identity, her fame, her position, on that flawless white face. To abandon the makeup would have meant abandoning the very thing that defined her in the eyes of the world. So she kept applying it, choosing the look she was known for over the health she was losing, in a bargain that feels heartbreakingly recognizable even centuries later. We may have swapped the lead for other things, but the willingness to trade well-being for an ideal has never really left us, and so we reach the strange, sobering peak of the pale obsession, where powerful queens and celebrated beauties alike poison themselves for a complexion that meant status, refinement, and worth. For all these long centuries, the rule held firm and the price kept being paid. Pale was the goal, the sun was the enemy, and beauty was a toll collected in slow harm. Yet beneath all the powder and danger, something simpler and more honest was always going on. A single unspoken truth that explains every veil, every parasol, every pot of poison we've encountered so far. And in the next stretch of our journey, we'll strip away the cosmetics entirely and look that truth dead in the eye. Because understanding it is the key to understanding why the whole obsession was about to flip completely on its head. By now you've probably spotted the pattern humming beneath all of this, and it's worth saying out loud. Pale skin was never really about colour. It was about advertising idleness. Every parasol twirled, every glove buttoned, every patch of powdered white was a billboard declaring that the wearer didn't have to work, didn't have to sweat, and didn't have to step into the sun for any reason more pressing than a leisurely stroll. The beauty standard was in effect a costume of wealth that you wore on your own face. A tan said somebody owns my labour. Pallor said I own somebody else's. For century after century, the goal of the upper class wasn't to look like they'd done something impressive. It was to look like they had never done anything at all. Think about how unusual that is as a way to show off. In most arenas of human bragging, we display effort and achievement. We want people to see the muscles we built, the trophies we won, the work we put in. But the pale skin game ran in the opposite direction entirely. The flex was emptiness, absence, the visible proof that nothing had ever been demanded of you. It was the aristocratic equivalent of leaving your expensive car parked and unused simply to show you didn't need to drive anywhere. The whole appeal lay in conspicuous uselessness, and an entire social order organised itself around displaying exactly how little it had to do. The accessories of this performance were a language all their own, fluent and instantly understood. A parasol wasn't really about shade. It was a portable announcement that this person's skin was too precious to risk. Gloves in mild weather said the same thing about the hands. The little black beauty patches dotted across a powdered face served partly to draw the eye to how flawlessly pale the surrounding skin was, like framing a painting to highlight the canvas. Every one of these props existed to broadcast the same message in slightly different dialects. I am protected. I am idle. I am of a class that the sun is not permitted to touch. You could read a person's entire social standing off their accessories before they said a word, and the people on the receiving end of this performance understood it perfectly, which was the whole point. A beauty standard only works if everyone agrees on what it means, and on this society had reached an iron consensus. When a pale, gloved, parasol-shaded lady passed a brown, bare-armed field worker, both of them knew exactly what the difference signified, and so did everyone watching. The code didn't need explaining because it had been absorbed over countless generations. Pale meant up, brown meant down, and the gap between them was a settled fact of life as solid as the ground itself. That shared understanding was what gave the whole costume its power. Which brings us to the genuinely fascinating question, lurking underneath this entire history, the one we've been circling all along. If pale skin was desirable purely because it advertised a life without labour, then what would happen if the relationship between labour and the sun ever changed? What if the day came when working no longer meant being outdoors, when the poor were suddenly the ones stuck inside and the rich were the ones with time to play in the open air? The entire logic of pale beauty rested on a single assumption about who worked where, and that assumption was about to be shattered by the loudest, smokiest, most transformative upheaval in human history. But before we reach that great flip, we have to spend a little time in the era that pushed the pale obsession to its most rigid, most anxious, most freckle-fearing extreme. Welcome to the Victorian era, where the obsession with flawless, untouched skin reached a fevered, almost moral intensity. A proper lady was meant to be lily-white, smooth, and entirely unmarked, and against this impossible ideal, a single freckle became a small catastrophe. Freckles, tan lines, and any hint of colour were treated not as charming quirks, but as evidence that a woman had been careless, exposed, or worst of all, out doing something that resembled work. Magazines and beauty manuals overflowed with breathless advice on banishing every speck of pigment from the skin. The sun was an enemy to be defeated with bonnets, gloves, veils, and vigilance. And a woman's complexion was a battlefield she was expected to defend daily, as though her entire respectability lived in the surface of her cheeks. The Victorians wrapped their beauty standards in a thick blanket of morality, which is what made this era so particularly intense. Paleness wasn't simply attractive, it was proper, modest, virtuous, the outward sign of a sheltered and respectable inner life. A delicate, untouched complexion suggested a woman who stayed close to home, who didn't gad about in the rough outdoor world, who embodied the gentle, protected femininity the age idolized. A freckled or tanned face, by contrast, hinted at a woman who'd been wandering, exposed, perhaps even labouring, all of which carried a faint whiff of impropriety. The skin had become a kind of moral résumé, and a single sunspot could leave a smudge on it. The advice literature of the time treated freckle prevention and removal with the gravity of a serious public health matter. Ladies were instructed to wear veils whenever outdoors, to carry parasols religiously, to don gloves and broad bonnets, and to retreat from sunshine the moment it threatened. And for the freckles that slipped through these defences anyway, there was a thriving market of creams, lotions, and treatments, promising to bleach them away. Some were mild, some were harsh, and more than a few leaned on the same dubious chemistry that had been quietly harming people for centuries. The war on the freckle was waged on two fronts at once: prevention through obsessive covering, and correction through whatever the apothecary was selling that week. It's worth pausing to appreciate just how exhausting this must have been to live inside. Imagine treating every walk outside, every carriage ride, every moment in a sunny room as a threat to your social standing. Imagine inspecting your face in the mirror with genuine anxiety, scanning for the faint freckle that might mark you as careless or common. The mental energy poured into guarding a complexion was enormous, a constant low hum of vigilance running beneath daily life. And it fell almost entirely on women, who bore the weight of an ideal that punished them for the simple act of existing under the same sky as everyone else. But here is the quiet, momentous thing happening in the background of all this Victorian freckle fearing, the thing almost nobody noticed at the time. While the upper classes fussed and shaded and bleached, the world around them was transforming at terrifying speed. Smokestacks were rising, factories were roaring to life, and millions of people were being pulled off the sunlit land and packed into dim, crowded workrooms. The ancient connection between poverty and sun exposure, the very foundation on which the entire pale ideal had been built, was beginning to crack. And once it broke completely, the Victorians' desperate war on the freckle would suddenly look like the last frantic defence of a standard whose time had nearly run out. If you thought the lead makeup was the low point, prepare yourself, because the Victorians found a way to go even further. To achieve that coveted, translucent, almost otherworldly paleness, some people turned to arsenic, consuming it in the form of complexion wafers and tonics that promised clear, luminous, ghostly skin. Arsenic, the same substance with a long and distinguished history as a murder weapon, was marketed as a beauty aid you could swallow with a straight face. The logic, such as it was, held that a careful dose would lighten the complexion and lend the skin a delicate, fashionable pallor. The reality was that you were poisoning yourself in slow, deliberate sips for the sake of looking refined. Somewhere along the way, the line between cosmetics counter and poison cabinet had completely dissolved. The crucial difference here, the thing that separates arsenic from the lead paint of earlier eras, is that this poison was meant to be eaten. The white lead, dreadful as it was, at least sat on the outside of the skin. The arsenic wafers and tonics asked you to take the toxin directly into your body, to ingest it on purpose, in the cheerful belief that it would brighten you from the inside out. Advertisements promised that these little wafers would clear the complexion, banish blemishes, and produce that delicate, transparent paleness the age adored. They were sold openly, packaged attractively, and taken by people who trusted that something on sale couldn't possibly be that dangerous. It was, of course, exactly that dangerous. Arsenic also developed a reputation in this period for its supposed benefits beyond the complexion, with some users claiming it improved their vitality and figure as well, which only made it more appealing and more widely consumed. There were even tales of communities where people built up a tolerance by taking small regular doses, treating a deadly poison as a kind of daily supplement. Whether or not every story was true, the mere fact that arsenic could be discussed as a wellness product tells you everything about how blurry the boundary between medicine, beauty, and poison had become. People genuinely believed they were improving themselves, taking control of their appearance, when in fact they were conducting a slow chemical experiment on their own organs. The dark genius of arsenic, from the poison's point of view, was how gradual and deniable its harm could be. The damage accumulated quietly over months and years, manifesting as vague illness, fatigue, and decline that could easily be blamed on anything else. A woman might feel steadily worse while looking for a time exactly as pale and delicate as she'd hoped, never suspecting that her beauty regimen was the cause of her suffering. It was a perfect, terrible trap, delivering the desired result and the hidden penalty in the same small wafer, with no warning label and no way for the average person to connect the two. Trust, ignorance, and social pressure did the rest, and so the pale ideal reached perhaps its most absurd and chilling conclusion, with fashionable people literally eating poison to look the part. Stack it all up, the lead, the mercury, the bloodletting, the arsenic, and the pursuit of pale beauty starts to resemble a centuries-long act of collective accidental self-harm, all in service of advertising a life without toil. But while a slice of society was busy swallowing arsenic to look like it had never seen the sun, the great machine of the modern world was rumbling toward a transformation that would make the entire enterprise pointless. The pale obsession had reached its peak, and peaks, by their nature, are followed by the descent. The flip was coming, and it would arrive on a tide of coal smoke. Now spare a thought for the people on the other side of this beauty equation, the labourers, the farm hands, the field workers who had no choice in the matter. While the wealthy spent fortunes and risked their lives to look untouched, the working class was branded by the sun whether they liked it or not. Long days under open sky etched tans and lines into their skin that no amount of scrubbing could erase, and that colour marked them instantly as poor, as common, as built for toil. There was no escaping it, and no faking your way out of it. Your complexion was a class label stamped onto you by your own daily survival. In a world that prized pale skin above almost everything, the sheer act of working to stay alive permanently disqualified you from the beauty standard. Consider the impossible bind these people lived inside. The beauty ideal of their society held up pale, untouched skin as the height of desirability and worth, and then made that ideal completely unreachable for the very people who needed to work outdoors to eat. It's a bit like running a race where the prize is given out before the starting gun, awarded entirely on the basis of who you were born to. A field worker could not simply decide to stay indoors and stay pale, because staying indoors meant not working, and not working meant not surviving. The standard wasn't just hard for them to reach. It was structurally, permanently sealed off, locked behind the iron door of economic necessity. And the sun was relentless in its bookkeeping. A labourer didn't get to be tanned only on the days they chose. They were tanned every day, year-round, with the colour deepening and the lines carving deeper as the seasons stacked up. Their skin became a permanent record of their labour, leathery and weathered in a way that announced their station from across a market square. No clever borrowing of a fine garment could disguise it. No occasional rest could undo it. The tan wasn't a temporary souvenir of a sunny afternoon. It was a lifelong uniform issued by the work itself, impossible to remove and impossible to hide. What makes this genuinely cruel, rather than merely unfair, is the layer of moral judgment that society piled on top. The working person wasn't simply seen as poor because of their tan. They were often seen as coarse, lesser, even slightly disreputable, as though their sun-darkened skin reflected some failing of character rather than the plain fact of honest work. The same labour that fed the entire society, that grew the food and built the structures and made the comfortable lives of the pale elite possible, was the exact thing that condemned its doers to the bottom of the beauty hierarchy. They were punished, aesthetically and morally, for the indispensable work everyone depended on. So the working class lived under a beauty standard that was custom-built to exclude them, a standard that celebrated the absence of the very thing their lives required. It was the pale obsession's most honest feature, and its ugliest one, a clear, unspoken declaration that beauty belonged to those who didn't have to labour, and that those who did were simply out of the running by definition. For as long as work meant the outdoors and idleness meant the indoors, this brutal arithmetic held firm. But the ground beneath that arithmetic was about to shift in the most dramatic way imaginable. And when it did, the whole equation, working class and leisure class alike, would be turned completely upside down. And then, slowly, quietly, the entire 1,000-year logic began to invert, and almost nobody noticed it happening. The culprit was the Industrial Revolution. As factories rose and cities swelled, the working masses were no longer toiling in sunlit fields. They were crammed indoors, hunched over machines in dim, smoky workrooms for endless hours. The result was a generation of labourers who were now pale, sickly, and sun-starved, while pale skin quietly lost its exclusive grip on the upper class. Suddenly, being indoors and colourless wasn't proof of wealth at all. It was proof you worked in a factory. The old equation that had ruled beauty for centuries was about to be turned completely upside down, and the people who once hid from the sun would soon go chasing after it like it had just announced a sale. Picture the new world taking shape in the factory towns, where work had once meant open air, ploughed earth, and the wide sky. It now meant the inside of a building, the rattle of machinery, the smoke, the gloom, and the grinding hours that left little time for daylight at all. The factory worker laboured indoors all day and trudged home in the dark, their skin growing pale not from privilege but from sheer deprivation of sunlight. This new urban pallor wasn't the soft, cherished fairness of a sheltered lady. It was the grey, unhealthy whiteness of someone starved of fresh air and sun, and everyone could tell the difference. Paleness had suddenly acquired a second, far less flattering meaning. Meanwhile, up at the top of society, something equally significant was happening, though it crept in unnoticed at first. The wealthy still didn't have to work, but increasingly they were the only ones with the time, money, and freedom to spend their days outdoors for pleasure, to travel to sunny places, to lounge in gardens and by the sea. Leisure was migrating outside, into the very sunshine the elite had spent centuries avoiding. The exclusive privilege was no longer staying out of the sun. It was being able to go out into it whenever you pleased, for no reason other than enjoyment. The location of luxury had quietly moved from the shaded indoors to the open air, and a tan was about to become the new badge of that freedom. It's worth marvelling at how perfectly the underlying logic survived this enormous reversal. The beauty standard didn't suddenly become rational or fair. It simply tracked, as faithfully as ever, whatever the rich could do that the poor could not. When the poor worked outside, the rich prized pale skin. Now that the poor worked inside, the rich would come to prize a tan. The skin colour flipped, but the function never changed for a moment. Beauty remained exactly what it had always been, a visible advertisement of leisure, an announcement of the kind of life you could afford to live. The mechanism was untouched, only the costume had been swapped out. So the great inversion was set in motion, not by any decree or sudden change of taste, but by the slow churn of smokestacks and machinery rearranging where people spent their days. The pale ideal that had reigned for millennia, that had poisoned queens and excluded the labouring masses, was quietly losing the very foundation it had always stood on. The world was being reshuffled, and with it the meaning of sun-touched skin. But a beauty standard this old and this entrenched doesn't collapse on its own. It needs a push, a new story, a fresh reason to want what was once unthinkable. And that push would come from an unexpected place, not from fashion at first, but from the doctors and the sick beds, who were about to declare that the sun the elite had feared for so long might just be the cure they'd been missing all along. Just as the social ground was shifting, the medical world delivered a plot twist of its own. Physicians began discovering that sunlight, the very thing the elite had spent millennia avoiding, was actually good for you, in measured doses anyway. Sunlight was found to help treat conditions like rickets, the bone-softening disease rampant among sun-deprived city children, and it became a celebrated therapy for tuberculosis and other ailments. Sanatoriums opened in sunny climates, and patients were wheeled out to bask in the rays as a genuine prescription. This new practice, sometimes called heliotherapy, reframed the sun overnight from a destroyer of complexions into a giver of health. For the first time in recorded history, exposing your skin to sunlight wasn't reckless or low class. It was downright medicinal. The timing of this discovery could hardly have been more poetic. Just as the crowded, smoke-choked industrial cities were producing armies of pale, sun-starved, vitamin-deprived children with soft, deformed bones, medicine arrived to point at the sun and say, "That's the missing ingredient." Rickets, which left children weak and bow-legged, turned out to be deeply connected to a lack of sunlight, and exposure to the sun could help prevent and treat it. Suddenly the sun wasn't a vain woman's enemy or a peasant's curse. It was a serious tool of healing, urgently needed by the very urban populations that the new factory world had locked away from it. The villain of the beauty story was being recast as a doctor. Sanatoriums embraced this idea with enthusiasm, building their whole approach around fresh air and sunshine. Patients suffering from tuberculosis and other conditions were sent to sunny mountain retreats and seaside resorts, where they spent hours lying in the open, soaking up the light as a central part of their treatment. Being out in the sun became something a respectable person did for their health, even on the orders of a physician, which gave it an entirely new and legitimate status. The act of deliberately exposing your skin to sunlight, once associated only with toil and low birth, was now wrapped in the authority of medicine and the promise of recovery. That is a powerful endorsement, and it cracked open the door for everything that followed. You can feel the centuries-old fear beginning to dissolve in this moment. For generation upon generation, the sun had been treated as something to dodge, to shade against, to protect oneself from at all costs. Now here were trusted doctors, the most authoritative voices a person could consult, calmly recommending the opposite. Get out in the sun. Let the light reach your skin. It's good for you. When the experts reverse a belief that fundamental, ordinary people follow, because most of us, then as now, take our cues about what's healthy from those we trust to know. The emotional grip of the old fear was loosened not by fashion but by science, or at least by the science of the day, so the stage was almost fully set. The industrial world had inverted who stayed indoors and who got to go out, quietly stripping pale skin of its prestige. And now medicine had recast the sun as a healer rather than a hazard, giving people permission, even encouragement, to seek it out. All the pieces were in place for the most dramatic reversal in the history of beauty, needing only a spark to set it alight. A single fashionable moment to take these abstract shifts and crystallize them into a craze. That spark, according to legend, would come from a tan, a famous face, and a sun-soaked stretch of coastline, in a story that the fashion world has been happily retelling ever since. Now we arrive at the moment legend loves best, the spark that supposedly tipped the whole world over. The story goes that in the early 1920s, the famous fashion designer Coco Chanel returned from a sun-soaked cruise along the French Riviera with a deep, glowing tan, and instead of being scandalized, society swooned. Whether she truly invented the trend single-handedly, or simply gave it the perfect famous face at the perfect moment, the effect was electric. Almost suddenly, a tan stopped meaning peasant and started meaning yacht. It signalled leisure, travel, sunshine, and the kind of free time only the wealthy could afford. The same brown skin that would have shamed a medieval lady into hiding now whispered glamour, money, and a holiday you couldn't possibly pronounce. The pendulum had begun its enormous swing. It's important to be honest about the legend, because no single person flips 1,000 years of beauty standards on a whim. Chanel didn't wake up one morning and decree that tans were fashionable while the world meekly obeyed. What she did, by being a tastemaker of immense influence at exactly the right moment, was put a glamorous, aspirational face on a shift that the deeper currents of history had already set in motion. The industrial inversion and the medical rehabilitation of the sun had done the heavy lifting in the background. The moment simply needed a symbol, and a celebrated designer stepping off a yacht with bronzed skin was a symbol the fashionable world could understand instantly. She didn't start the fire so much as strike the match over the kindling that was already stacked. But what a match it was! Chanel embodied modernity, freedom, and effortless chic, and her influence shaped how an entire generation of women wanted to look and live. So when she appeared sun-kissed and unbothered, it didn't read as a fashion error, it read as the future. If this woman, the very arbiter of style, found a tan desirable, then a tan was desirable, and the old associations with toil and low birth began to crumble in real time. The glamorous people took their cue, and the tan was rapidly rebranded from a mark of shame into a mark of sophistication. It was one of those rare moments when a long, slow shift suddenly becomes visible, when the change that had been building for decades finally announces itself in a single, irresistible image, and the meaning the tan now carried was perfectly calibrated to the new world. A tan said you'd been somewhere warm and beautiful, that you'd had the leisure to lie in the sun, that you could afford to travel to the kinds of places where sunshine was abundant and responsibilities were not. It was the visible souvenir of a life of freedom and pleasure, the opposite of being chained indoors to a machine or a desk. In a single elegant stroke, sun-touched skin became the emblem of exactly the privilege that pale skin had once represented, just relocated to the beach. The logic hadn't changed at all. The wealthy were still advertising their leisure on their bodies. They'd simply moved the advertisement outdoors. So there it is, the great hinge of our entire story, the moment the pendulum reversed its centuries-long swing. The tan that had branded peasants, shamed labourers, and sent noble women scurrying for parasols was now the most coveted accessory in fashionable society, a glowing badge of money and freedom. The world had completed an astonishing about-face, and it had done so while keeping its underlying snobbery perfectly intact. With the tan newly crowned as desirable, the playgrounds of the rich were transformed to match, turning the sunny coastlines they'd once visited only in winter into summer stages for the serious, dedicated business of getting bronze. The age of sun worship was about to begin in earnest. With the tan suddenly fashionable, the playgrounds of the rich transformed before everyone's eyes. The French Riviera, once a quiet winter retreat, where the wealthy went specifically to avoid the brutal summer sun, flipped into a summer destination where the entire point was to soak it up. The beautiful people flocked to the coast to lie in the sand, swim in the sea, and roast themselves golden, treating their own skin like a slow-cooking trophy. A bronze glow became living proof that you'd spent your weeks lounging seaside rather than chained to a desk or a machine. The beach, formerly a place of labour for fishermen and a place of horror for pale aristocrats, became the most aspirational stage on earth. To be tanned was now to be seen in all the right places. The reversal of the Riviera season tells the whole story in miniature. Previously the fashionable had come to that coast in the cooler months and fled before the summer heat arrived, because no respectable person wanted to be roasting under the strong sun. Now the calendar flipped entirely. Summer, the season of maximum sunshine, became the season everyone wanted to be there, precisely because the sunshine was the attraction. The hotels that had once closed for the hot months reopened to serve a crowd that had come specifically to bake. It was the same coastline, the same sun, the same sand, transformed from something to escape into something to chase, all because the meaning of a tan had been turned inside out. And the activity itself lying still in the sun deserves a moment of appreciation for how strange it is. Sunbathing is, when you describe it plainly, the act of lying motionless on the ground while a star slowly changes the colour of your skin. Yet it became a serious leisure pursuit, a thing people travelled hundreds of miles and spent good money to do. They arranged themselves on the sand, turned at intervals like something on a rotisserie, and measured their success by how deeply they'd browned. The tan was the product, and the body was the canvas, and the whole enterprise was conducted with the dedicated focus of people pursuing a genuine goal. Doing nothing had become an achievement you could show off, which is the purest expression of leisure ever devised. The beach's transformation in the social imagination is equally remarkable. For the fishermen and dock workers of earlier centuries, the seaside was a place of hard, dangerous, sun-scorched labour, and their tans were the badge of that grind. For the pale aristocrat, the beach had been a place to avoid, all that exposed sun threatening the precious complexion. Now the same stretch of sand became the most glamorous setting imaginable, a stage where the fashionable displayed their leisure, their bodies, their freedom, and of course their bronzing skin. The location hadn't changed. Its meaning had been completely rewritten, turning a site of toil and avoidance into the very heart of aspiration. So the geography of status reorganized itself around the new ideal, with the sunny coastlines of the world becoming the places to be seen, and the tan becoming the proof you'd been there. The wealthy now advertised their privilege by going out into the very sun their ancestors had spent fortunes hiding from, and they did it gladly, even competitively. The complete inversion was no longer just a fashion notion floating in the air. It was carved into where people travelled and how they spent their leisure. And as the tan settled firmly into its new role as the badge of the good life, it's worth stepping back to fully appreciate the sheer scale of what had happened, because reversals this total are rare in human history, and the lesson buried inside this one is genuinely worth holding on to. Take a moment to appreciate the sheer scale of the reversal, because it is genuinely one of history's great about faces. For thousands of years, a tan screamed poverty, toil, and the bottom of the social ladder. Now, in the span of a generation or two, that exact same tan screamed wealth, leisure, and the very top. The logic, once you unpack it, was perfectly consistent with everything that came before. Beauty had always tracked whatever the rich could do that the poor could not. When the poor worked outside, the rich stayed pale. When the poor were trapped inside factories, the rich went outside to play. The skin tone changed, but the underlying message never did. Beauty was, as ever, simply a way of wearing your free time where everyone could see it. Sit with the symmetry of it, because it's almost too neat to be real. A medieval peasant and a 20th century factory worker could have stood side by side, one brown from the fields and one pale from the workroom, and each would have been at the bottom of the beauty hierarchy of their own time for opposite reasons. The peasant was scorned for being tanned. The factory worker was, in the new order, unfashionable for being pale. The same two skin tones swapped their meanings entirely, while the people wearing them stayed exactly where they'd always been, at the bottom. The standard moved, the social flaw did not. That is as clear a demonstration as you could ask for that the whole game was never about colour at all. What was the new privilege the tan advertised? Time and money, the same things pale skin had always announced, just expressed through a different activity. A deep tan now signalled that you could afford to travel to sunny destinations, that you had leisure hours to fill lying on a beach, that your life contained enough freedom and surplus to spend it browning in the open air. The man with the year-round bronze wasn't suggesting he worked hard outdoors. Everyone understood he played hard outdoors, which was the entire point. His tan was a passport stamp, a holiday receipt, a quiet boast about the kind of life that most people could only dream of. It said leisure just as loudly as a parasol once had, only with the opposite colour. There's a useful and slightly humbling lesson tucked inside this whole reversal, one that reaches well beyond the question of skin. It's a reminder of how arbitrary our beauty standards really are, how completely they can flip while feeling, in any given moment, like timeless and obvious truths. The Victorian lady was certain, to her bones, that pale skin was beautiful and tanned skin was common. The sunbather of a few decades later was equally certain of the precise opposite. Both believed they were simply recognising what was attractive, when in fact they were both just reading the current social code of who got to be idle. The standards we hold today, whatever they are, feel just as permanent and just as obvious, which should give us pause. So the tan completed its astonishing journey from shame to status, carrying with it a quiet warning about how thoroughly fashion can rewrite our deepest assumptions. The rich had simply found a new way to display the oldest thing of all, their freedom from labour, and the world had reorganised its sense of beauty to match. But this newly crowned ideal came with a problem the old pale standard never faced, a practical, painful obstacle that threatened to spoil the whole party. Because as people threw themselves into the sun with unprecedented enthusiasm, they discovered the hard way that the sun doesn't only bronze you. Often and painfully it burns. And solving that problem would give rise to an entire industry built on a delicious contradiction. As sunbathing exploded into a full-blown craze, an obvious problem emerged. People were burning themselves to a crisp in pursuit of that perfect glow. Enter the early sunscreens. In the 1930s, the founder of a major cosmetics company created one of the first commercial sun protection products, born of a desire to enjoy the sun without quite so much agony. Around the same era, a chemist working during the Second World War developed a thick reddish protective substance to shield soldiers from blistering tropical sun, and that wartime invention helped lead to one of the most famous suntan brands in the world. It's a delicious irony worth savouring. The very industry built to protect us from the sun grew up hand in hand with the new obsession of deliberately lying out in it. The problem these inventors were solving was real and painful. The human body, it turns out, did not evolve to be slowly roasted for hours in pursuit of fashion, and the sun's response to all this eager exposure was the sunburn, that red, tender, peeling misery familiar to anyone who's ever overestimated their tolerance for a beach day. As more and more people chased the bronze ideal, more and more of them got scorched, and a clear market opened up for anything that could let you stay out longer without turning into a lobster. The desire wasn't to avoid the sun, mind you. It was to survive more of it. People wanted to bake without burning, to brown without blistering, and the early sun products were designed to deliver exactly that compromise. The wartime origins of one of these products add a fascinating wrinkle to the story. A chemist developed a heavy reddish substance to protect soldiers stationed in punishing tropical sunlight, where sunburn wasn't a vanity concern but a genuine threat to fighting men. That practical military invention, born of necessity rather than fashion, went on to help inspire one of the most recognizable suntan brands in the world, the kind of name that would later become synonymous with beach culture itself. There's something wonderfully human about a product designed to protect soldiers in war ending up as the companion to leisurely afternoons of recreational tanning. Necessity and vanity, once again, sharing the very same bottle. But the deeper irony is the one truly worth dwelling on, because it reveals the strange contradiction at the heart of this whole new era. An entire industry sprang up to protect people from the sun, and yet its purpose, in those early days, wasn't really to keep people out of the sun at all. It was to keep them in it longer. The protection existed to enable the exposure. People slathered on products designed to shield their skin precisely, so they could spend more time deliberately exposing that skin to the very thing the product guarded against. It was protection in service of risk, a safety measure that encouraged the dangerous behaviour it claimed to defend against. Few industries have ever been founded on such a beautifully tangled premise, and so the modern sun era took its full shape, complete with a thriving business built to manage the consequences of an obsession it also helped sustain. Sunbathing was glamorous, the tan was king, and now you could pursue both a little more comfortably with a tube of protection in your beach bag. The dangers lurking in all that sun exposure were still decades away from being properly understood, so for now the mood was pure sunny optimism. The bronze was beautiful, the beaches were full, and the only real enemy was the burn, which the helpful bottle promised to hold at bay. With that obstacle softened, the world was free to throw itself into sun worship more completely than ever, and the glittering machinery of Hollywood and beach culture stood ready to make that worship look like the most desirable thing on earth. The glamour machine of the early to mid-20th century poured fuel on the bronzed fire. Film stars and magazine covers paraded golden, glowing skin as the height of health and desirability, and beach culture bloomed alongside ever-shrinking swimwear. The more skin people were willing to show, the more skin there was to tan, and the two trends fed each other beautifully. Sunbathing became a leisure ritual, a thing you scheduled, a a thing you travelled for. Where a Victorian lady once measured her worth by how thoroughly she'd hidden from daylight, the modern beauty measured hers by how evenly she'd browned. Looking like you'd spent the season outdoors went from social poison to social currency, and an entire culture lined up to lie down in the sand and cook. Hollywood was the great amplifier in all of this, taking the new tan ideal and broadcasting it to millions through the most seductive medium ever invented. When the people on the silver screen, the most admired and imitated humans alive, glowed with golden, sun-kissed skin, audiences absorbed the message without needing a single word of explanation. A tan looked like health, like vitality, like the carefree glamour of stars who summered in beautiful places and never seemed to have a worry. Magazine covers reinforced it relentlessly. Page after page of bronze beauty presented as the obvious goal. The standard wasn't argued for, it was simply shown, over and over, until wanting a tan felt as natural as wanting to breathe. The evolution of swimwear played a sneaky but crucial role, expanding the very canvas the tan was painted on. As bathing costumes shrank from the heavy, all-covering garments of earlier generations toward lighter, briefer designs, more and more skin was suddenly available to be browned, and a pale patch where the fabric had been began to look like a flaw. The shrinking swimsuit and the spreading tan pushed each other forward in a tidy loop. Less fabric meant more exposed skin meant more tanning, and more tanning made the tan lines from yesterday's larger suit look hopelessly out of date. Fashion and sunshine conspired together, and the body became a steadily larger billboard for leisure. It's worth noting how completely the emotional charge around the sun had reversed by this point. For all those centuries, sunlight was the threat, the thing to dodge, the enemy at the gate. Now it was the source of everything desirable, courted and welcomed and actively pursued. People rearranged their summers around it, lay still for hours in its glare, and felt genuinely cheerful about the whole exercise. The dread their ancestors felt at the thought of a sunbeam landing on a noble cheek had been replaced by something close to longing. We had taken the oldest enemy in the history of beauty and turned it into the most beloved friend, and we did it in just a few short decades. So by the middle of the century, sun worship was fully woven into the culture, glamorized by the movies, encouraged by the magazines, and made practical by the helpful bottle of protection in every beach bag. The tan was no longer a fresh, surprising trend. It was an established fact of beauty, as settled and obvious as pale skin had once been. The whole apparatus of popular culture stood behind it, presenting the bronze glow as the natural look of the healthy, happy, fortunate person. And as the 1950s dawned, this devotion to the tan would crystallize into a full-blown beauty ideal, complete with its own rituals, its own products, and its own gleaming, oiled-up icon, the bronze goddess, frying herself golden with all the dedication of an artist at work. By the 1950s, the tan had fully cemented itself as a symbol of beauty, health, and the good life, and people pursued it with cheerful, reckless devotion. Out came the baby oil, slathered on not to block the sun but to attract it, frying the skin like a sausage in a pan. Sun reflectors, sometimes lined with foil, were angled to bounce extra rays onto eager faces. Tanning oils and lotions promised a deeper, faster glow, and the goal was always to go darker, richer, more golden. There was no fear in it, no caution, just pure sun worship, and the firm belief that a bronze body was a beautiful one. The idea that all this delightful roasting might come with a serious bill attached had simply not arrived at the party yet. The baby oil ritual deserves a special place in the Hall of Fame of questionable beauty practices. Here was a substance applied specifically because it helped the skin absorb more sun, not less, the exact opposite of protection, used by people who genuinely believed they were enhancing their tan, and they were, in the sense that oiled skin browns faster and deeper, much as a chicken brushed with oil crisps up nicely in the oven. The comparison is uncomfortable precisely because it's accurate. Sunbathers would coat themselves head to toe, stretch out under the full glare, and turn at intervals to ensure an even finish, treating their own bodies with the attentive care of a cook minding the roast. It was sun worship taken to its most literal, sizzling extreme. The reflectors took the dedication a step further into the realm of the wonderfully absurd. Not content with the sun's natural output, some tanners deployed boards and panels, occasionally lined with shiny foil, angled to bounce additional rays onto the face and neck for maximum browning. Picture someone lying on a beach, already baking in direct sun, deliberately positioning a mirror-like surface to concentrate even more light onto their skin, like a person using a magnifying glass on themselves. It was a level of commitment that bordered on the heroic, or perhaps the alarming, depending on how you look at it. The tan had become a goal worth genuine effort and ingenuity, pursued with tools and techniques and real strategy. A whole product economy bloomed to serve this devotion, with tanning oils and lotions promising faster, deeper, more glamorous colour. These weren't shields against the sun, they were accelerants, designed to help you brown more efficiently and look more spectacularly bronzed. The marketing leaned hard into glamour and allure, presenting the tan as the secret to looking healthy, sophisticated, and irresistibly attractive. Buying these products felt like investing in your own beauty, and using them felt like participating in something fashionable and modern. The industry had figured out that it could sell the means to a tan just as profitably as it might later sell the means to avoid one, a flexibility that would serve it very well in the decades to come. What makes the 1950s so striking in hindsight is the total, untroubled innocence of it all. There was no shadow hanging over the sun worship, no nagging worry, no warnings whispered in the back of the mind. People believed, sincerely and completely, that a tan was simply healthy and beautiful, full stop, and they chased it with the light-hearted enthusiasm of folks who had no reason to think otherwise. The serious reckoning, the moment when science would arrive to spoil the fun, was still off in the future. For now, the bronze goddess oiled up, angled her reflector and basked without a care, certain she was doing something wholesome, and the industry, always alert to a new opportunity, was about to offer the impatient and the sun-shy a tempting shortcut. A tan in a bottle, with no waiting and no sunshine required at all. Not everyone could afford a tropical holiday, and not everyone had the patience to lie in the sun for hours, so the beauty industry did what it always does. It found a way to sell the look without the wait. The early 1960s saw the arrival of the self-tanner, a lotion that promised to turn your skin golden without a single ray of sunlight, using an ingredient that reacts with the surface of the skin to darken it. The dream was a perfect tan from the comfort of your own bathroom. The reality, at least in those early days, was frequently a streaky, patchy, faintly orange disaster that fooled absolutely no one. Still, the door had been opened. For the first time, you could fake the colour that the rich had once spent fortunes acquiring, and you could do it indoors. The science behind the self-tanner was genuinely clever, even if the early results were not. The active ingredient reacted with the outermost layer of the skin to produce a temporary darkening, a colour that developed over a few hours and faded over a few days as the skin naturally shed. No sun, no waiting under the glare, no burning, just a lotion you rubbed on and watched develop. In principle, it was the perfect solution, delivering the fashionable bronze with none of the discomfort or the travel. The body could be browned on demand, on a schedule, regardless of season or weather, which was a remarkable thing to be able to do. The dream of a tan without the sun had become technically possible. The execution, however, took some time to catch up to the promise. Those early self-tanners were notoriously tricky, prone to developing unevenly, clinging to dry patches, pooling around the knees and elbows, and producing a colour that leaned more toward unconvincing orange than glowing gold. The telltale streaks announced the artifice to anyone paying attention, and the dreaded orange palms were a badge of the overeager amateur. Applying the stuff was an art that few had mastered, and the gap between the radiant result on the bottle and the patchy reality in the mirror could be vast. For a while, the fake tan was almost as likely to embarrass you as to flatter you, a promising idea still working out its considerable kinks. Yet for all its early stumbles, the self-tanner represented something genuinely significant, a quiet little revolution in the long story of skin and status. For the very first time, the tan could be detached from the sun, and therefore from the leisure and wealth it had always advertised. You no longer needed a yacht, a beach, or a free week in the sun to wear the colour of privilege. You needed a few coins and a bottle from the shop. The exclusive badge of the leisure class could now be applied in a suburban bathroom by anyone willing to risk the streaks. The democratization of the tan had begun, slowly chipping away at its status as a marker of the fortunate few. So the self-tanner took its place in the ever-expanding toolkit of the sun-obsessed era, sitting alongside the oils and the reflectors as one more way to chase the beloved bronze. It would keep improving over the years, eventually growing sophisticated enough to fool the eye and become a genuine staple. But in those early days it was mostly a hopeful, flawed novelty, a glimpse of a future where the tan and the sun might finally part ways. For now, though, most people still wanted the real thing, the deep, authentic colour that only genuine sun exposure could provide, and the industry was about to give them a way to get it any day of the year, in any weather, without ever leaving town. The age of the tanning bed was about to dawn, and with it, the obsession would reach its glowing, humming peak. The pursuit of year-round colour reached its glowing, humming peak with the invention of the indoor tanning bed in the late 1970s. Now there was no need to wait for summer, book a flight, or even step outside. You could simply climb into a coffin-shaped cabinet of ultraviolet lamps and bake yourself bronze in the dead of winter, all on your lunch break. Tanning salons sprang up everywhere, selling the fantasy of permanent vacation skin to anyone with a few coins and a free afternoon. It was convenient, it was affordable, and it felt thrillingly modern. The catch, the one nobody was eager to dwell on, was that you were voluntarily marinating yourself in concentrated ultraviolet radiation, the precise thing your ancestors had spent thousands of years frantically hiding from. The tanning bed solved the last great inconvenience of the tan, the weather and the calendar. Real sun was wonderful, but it was seasonal, unreliable, and geographically uncooperative, refusing to shine on demand in the depths of a grey winter. The indoor bed swept all of that aside. With a cabinet of ultraviolet lamps, you could summon summer skin in January, maintain a steady bronze through the bleakest months, and never let your fashionable colour fade no matter what the sky was doing. The tan, once dependent on travel and good fortune and the rhythm of the seasons, became something you could schedule like a haircut. It was the ultimate convenience, and the people who wanted colour year-round embraced it with open arms. The business of indoor tanning grew with remarkable speed, salons appearing on high streets and in shopping centres, offering quick, affordable sessions to a steady stream of customers. It fit perfectly into busy modern life. Pop in for a few minutes, climb into the bed, emerge a little more golden, and carry on with your day. The price was accessible, the experience was easy, and the result was reliable, all of which made it enormously popular. The tan had been industrialized, packaged into a tidy commercial service available on practically every corner. What had once required a voyage to the Riviera could now be had between errands, and millions took advantage of exactly that. But beneath the convenience lay an uncomfortable truth that the cheerful salon atmosphere worked hard not to mention. The tanning bed produced its colour by bathing the body in concentrated ultraviolet radiation, the very component of sunlight responsible for the damage that science was only beginning to fully grasp. There was a dark comedy in it, really. After thousands of years of humans treating the sun as a threat and shielding themselves from its rays, here we were building machines specifically to deliver those rays in a focused, repeated, deliberate dose. We had come so far around the circle that we had invented a device to do to ourselves, on purpose and for money, what our ancestors had dreaded above all else. The enemy had been bottled, electrified, and sold by the minute. So the indoor tan completed the era's transformation of sun worship into a year-round, on-demand industry, the obsession reaching a peak that earlier generations could scarcely have imagined. The tan was now utterly detached from season, geography, and even daylight itself, available to anyone, any time, in a humming cabinet down the street. It felt like progress, like the triumph of modern convenience over nature's stubborn limitations. And riding the crest of this peak, the obsession would surge into the following decade with even greater intensity, producing a culture so devoted to the bronze that it would chase the colour at almost any cost, embodied by gleaming icons whose tans seemed less like a feature and more like an entire personality. If the 50s loved a tan and the 70s industrialized it, the 1980s practically built a religion around it. The deep, leathery, year-round bronze became a badge of vitality, success, and effortless cool, immortalized by celebrities whose tans seemed to enter the room before they did. Tanning salons boomed, beaches stayed crowded, and people pushed their skin to ever darker extremes, sometimes burning themselves on purpose in the name of a better base layer. The tan was no longer just attractive, it was aspirational, a shorthand for the kind of glamorous, leisurely life everyone was supposed to want. Caution was for cowards, and sunscreen, when used at all, was often chosen for how little it interfered with the all-important goal of getting as brown as humanly possible. The decade had a particular flavour to its sun worship, a kind of excess and conspicuous abundance that ran through everything it touched. The ideal tan wasn't a subtle hint of colour, it was deep, dark, and unmistakable, worn proudly as proof that you had it all and lived large. Certain celebrities became so famous for their permanent gleaming bronze that the tan practically became their trademark, an inseparable part of their image and allure. To be deeply tanned was to look prosperous, healthy, and effortlessly fashionable, the very picture of success. The colour had taken on a confident, almost aggressive quality, less a gentle glow and more a bold statement about the kind of person you were. The lengths people went to in pursuit of this ideal could be genuinely alarming, and the era's casual attitude towards sun damage looks frankly reckless from where we now stand. The notion of the base tan, the idea that you should deliberately brown yourself early so you could tan harder later, encouraged people to seek out exposure rather than avoid it. Some treated a sunburn as merely an awkward stage on the road to a deeper colour, an inconvenience to push through rather than a warning to heed. The goal of maximum darkness overrode almost every other consideration, and the caution that might have protected people was widely dismissed as fussiness, fear, or a failure to commit to the look. Sunscreen, where it appeared at all, often played a strange and contradictory role in this culture. Rather than being chosen for protection, It was frequently selected for how little it would slow the tanning process down, prized for letting the maximum amount of colour through while offering the bare minimum of defence. The very product designed to shield the skin was being used as a tool to brown it more comfortably, its protective purpose subverted in service of the obsession. It was the perfect emblem of the era's priorities. Even the safety measure had been recruited into the pursuit of risk. Nothing was allowed to seriously interfere with the sacred goal of getting as dark as possible. So the obsession with the tan crested at its loudest, most extravagant height, a decade that worshipped the bronze with a devotion bordering on the absolute. The colour was everywhere, on the celebrities, on the beaches, in the salons, woven into the very image of the good life. The sun, that ancient enemy turned beloved friend, was now being courted more aggressively than ever before, with caution thrown to the wind and darkness pursued at nearly any cost. Yet even at this glittering peak, before we follow the story toward its eventual reckoning, it's worth pausing to step off the Western roller coaster entirely. Because while half the world was busy roasting itself golden, the other half had never stopped chasing the opposite dream, and their story complicates everything we've seen so far. It's worth stepping off the Western roller coaster for a moment, because not everyone joined the great tanning craze, and the story looks very different from other corners of the globe. Across much of Asia and many other cultures, lighter skin never lost its association with status, beauty and refinement, and the old logic held firm. Fair skin meant you weren't labouring under the sun. While Western beaches filled with people roasting themselves golden, enormous skin-lightening industries flourished elsewhere, selling the opposite dream. It's a striking reminder that there was never one single global standard, only the same deep human impulse playing out in mirror image. In one part of the world, people paid to get darker. In another, people paid to get lighter, and both were quietly chasing the very same thing, the appearance of a life without toil. In many societies, the connection between fair skin and high status remained remarkably stable across the very centuries when the West was busy turning its preferences inside out. The underlying reasoning was the same one we met at the very start of this whole journey. Outdoor labour darkened the skin, so lighter skin signalled that you didn't have to toil in the fields or the sun. Where that link between work and exposure stayed intact, the preference for paleness stayed right alongside it, untouched by the Western fashion for tanning. These weren't backward holdouts resisting progress. They were simply places where the social arithmetic that had once governed all of human beauty had never been scrambled by an industrial flip. The result was, and remains, a vast global industry devoted to lightening the skin, a near-perfect mirror image of the Western tanning business. Where one market sold oils and beds to darken, the other sold creams and treatments to lighten, both promising to deliver the appearance associated with status and ease. The scale of this skin-lightening market is enormous, spanning many countries and serving millions of people who pursue paleness with the same earnest hope that Western sunbathers brought to their tans. The two industries are essentially identical in spirit, differing only in the direction of the change they promise. Each sells the same fundamental fantasy, that you can purchase the look of belonging to a higher, more leisured class. Seen side by side, the two halves of the world reveal something important about the entire history we've been tracing. The specific colour that's prized is almost beside the point. What's constant is the impulse to signal status through skin, to wear one's distance from a labour on one's body. Pale or bronze, lighter or darker, the goal underneath is the same, and it's the same goal that drove the medieval lady and the 1980s sunbather alike. Beauty standards aren't recognitions of some neutral truth about what's attractive. They're social codes about who gets to be idle, and those codes can point in opposite directions in different places while serving the identical purpose. The mirror image isn't a contradiction, it's a confirmation, so the global picture adds a humbling final layer to the story of the tan, reminding us that the Western reversal we've been following was never the whole of humanity's relationship with skin and status. While one part of the world rode the pendulum from pale to bronze and beyond, another held steady on the side of fairness, each pursuing privilege through its own preferred shade. It complicates any tidy notion of progress or fashion, exposing the simpler and more universal truth beneath. And it sets the stage for the final act of the Western story, the moment when all that enthusiastic sun worship would collide head-on with cold, hard science, and the beloved tan would be handed a meaning no amount of glamour could disguise. And then, as it so often does, science arrived to ruin everyone's fun. Researchers steadily built an undeniable case that all that glorious ultraviolet exposure, the sunbathing, the baby oil, the tanning beds, came with a serious and frightening cost. Sun damage was linked to premature aging, leathery wrinkled skin, and far more alarmingly, to skin cancer, including its deadliest form, melanoma. The golden glow that had symbolized health for decades was revealed to be quite literally the skin reacting to injury. A tan, it turned out, was not a sign of wellness, but a visible scar of damage already done. Slowly, uncomfortably, the world began to absorb a deeply unwelcome truth. The thing it had spent half a century worshipping had been hurting people the entire time. The revelation about the tan itself was perhaps the most jarring part. People had always understood a tan as a sign of health, a glow that radiated vitality and well-being, the opposite of looking sick. Science delivered the unwelcome news that this was almost exactly backward. A tan is the skin's defensive response to ultraviolet damage, the body producing extra pigment in an attempt to shield itself from further harm, which means the very colour everyone prized was evidence that injury had already occurred. The bronze glow wasn't a sign of health at all, it was a sign of the skin trying to protect itself from a threat. The beloved tan was, in a real sense, a wound responding to attack, beautifully reframed as beauty. The connection to skin cancer was the part that truly chilled the celebration. As the research accumulated, the link between ultraviolet exposure and skin cancers, especially the dangerous melanoma, grew impossible to ignore. This wasn't a matter of vanity, of wrinkles and aging, though those were real consequences too. This was about a potentially deadly disease tied directly to the sun worship that had become a cultural norm. The cheerful afternoons on the beach, the lunchtime sessions in the tanning bed, the deliberate burning in pursuit of a base tan, all of it carried a genuine risk to life. The party that had felt so harmless and so glamorous turned out to have a serious, frightening bill attached after all. There's a deep and rather sobering irony threaded through this whole reckoning, one that ties the entire story together. For thousands of years, people had hidden from the sun, treating it as an enemy, shading and veiling and dodging its rays. Then, for a glorious few decades, they decided the sun was a friend and threw themselves into its embrace with reckless joy. And now, science was revealing that, when it came to the sun's potential to harm, the fearful ancestors had been closer to the mark than the carefree sunbathers. The instinct to protect the skin from the sun, dressed up in those earlier centuries as snobbery and vanity, turned out to have a kernel of genuine wisdom buried inside it. The wheel was preparing to turn yet again, so the great sun worship of the modern age ran headlong into the immovable wall of scientific evidence, and the collision changed everything. The tan could no longer be innocently celebrated as a badge of health and the good life, not once everyone understood what it really represented, The knowledge was uncomfortable, it was inconvenient, and it cut directly against decades of glamorous imagery and ingrained habit. But it was also undeniable. A cultural reckoning was now unavoidable, and the public health world would soon mobilize to undo the damage of all those sunny years, launching campaigns to convince a tan-loving population to do the once unthinkable. Cover up, seek the shade, and start treating the sun as something to respect rather than chase. With the dangers no longer deniable, public health stepped in with campaigns aimed at undoing decades of sun worship. In sun-drenched Australia, where skin cancer rates were soaring, a now famous campaign launched in the early 1980s urged people to slip on a shirt, slop on sunscreen, and slap on a hat, turning sun safety into a catchy, memorable little ritual. Sunscreen began to carry clearer protection ratings, and the message shifted from get as dark as you can to please, for the love of everything, cover up. It was a slow, stubborn cultural turn, fighting against generations of glamorous tanned imagery. But the warnings kept coming, the evidence kept stacking up, and the long love affair with the burning sun was, at last, beginning to cool. Australia made a natural front line for this battle, sitting under a fierce sun with a population that loved the outdoors and was paying the price in alarming rates of skin cancer. The catchy campaign that emerged there worked precisely because it was simple, friendly, and easy to remember, distilling sun safety into 3 breezy little actions anyone could recall. Slip on a shirt, slop on the sunscreen, slap on a hat. There was no lecturing, no grim statistics shoved in your face. Just a cheerful, sticky little phrase that lodged in the mind and nudged behaviour. It was public health with a sense of fun, and that lightness of touch helped it succeed where stern warnings might have failed. Sunscreen itself was changing in important ways during this period, growing from a simple tanning aid into a genuine protective tool with clearer information attached. Protection ratings appeared, giving people a way to understand how much defense a given product actually offered, and the whole conversation around sunscreen shifted. It was no longer the thing you used grudgingly to avoid burning so you could tan longer. It was increasingly the thing you used to shield your skin from real harm. The product that had once been recruited into the service of getting darker was being reborn as an instrument of protection, its original purpose finally taking centre stage as the culture's priorities began, slowly, to change. But changing a beauty standard is never quick, and this one had decades of glamorous momentum behind it. Generations had grown up believing a tan was healthy and beautiful, surrounded by tanned celebrities, sun-soaked advertisements, and the cheerful assumption that bronzing was simply what attractive people did. Asking all those people to suddenly cover up, seek the shade, and treat their beloved sun as a hazard was a tall order, and the shift came gradually against real resistance. Old habits and old ideals don't dissolve overnight just because the science has changed. They linger, they argue, they cling to the imagery that made them feel true. The reckoning was real, but it was a slow, uphill negotiation rather than a sudden conversion. Still, the direction of travel was now unmistakable, and the long sunny party was definitively winding down. The warnings accumulated, the campaign spread, the sunscreen improved, and bit by bit the culture began to absorb the uncomfortable truth and adjust its behaviour accordingly. The tan was losing its innocence, and sun protection was gaining respectability. The first clear signs of a pendulum once again reversing its swing, and that reversal was about to become official in the bluntest way imaginable, when the world's leading health authorities would step forward to classify the once glamorous tanning bed in the company of the most dangerous substances known, handing the modern tan a label that no marketing campaign could ever scrub away. The reckoning reached its blunt, official peak when leading health authorities formally classified ultraviolet tanning devices as cancer-causing, placing tanning beds in the same grim category as substances nobody wants anywhere near them. In 2009, the International Cancer Research Body elevated tanning beds to its highest carcinogen classification, a verdict that landed like a slammed door. Governments responded with restrictions, and many places moved to ban minors from using tanning beds altogether, treating the once trendy salon experience as a genuine public health hazard. The glamorous bronzing booth of the 80s had become something closer to a warning label on legs. The tan, that ancient symbol that had meant poverty, then wealth, then cool, had finally been handed a brand new meaning that no amount of marketing could spin: danger. The significance of that official classification is hard to overstate, because it moved the tanning bed from the realm of debatable risk into the realm of established top-tier hazard. To place ultraviolet tanning devices in the highest category of cancer-causing agents was to say, with the full authority of serious science, that this was not a matter of opinion or excessive caution. The glamorous machine that had hummed away in salons on every high street, that delivered convenient year-round bronze to millions, was now formally grouped among the things known to cause cancer in humans. That is a staggering fall from grace for a device that had so recently symbolized modern convenience and effortless beauty. The verdict was clinical, cold, and impossible to argue with. Governments around the world responded by treating tanning beds as the public health threat they had been declared to be, and the restrictions that followed marked a dramatic shift in attitude. The move to ban minors from using tanning beds was especially telling, drawing a clear line that said this activity was dangerous enough to keep young people away from entirely, much as society restricts other genuine hazards. The once casual salon visit, the thing teenagers might once have done without a second thought, was being formally recognised as carrying serious long-term risk. The industry that had boomed so spectacularly found itself increasingly regulated, restricted, and viewed with suspicion, its glamorous image replaced by something far more clinical and cautionary. It's worth dwelling on the full arc of the tan's journey at this moment, because the destination is genuinely remarkable. This was a thing that had once branded peasants as the lowest of the low, then been reborn as the glittering badge of wealth and leisure, then crowned as the very symbol of cool and success. And now, after all that, it had arrived at a meaning none of its earlier eras could have predicted: hazard, risk, a warning rather than a boast. The same colour that medieval ladies fled, that 1920s trendsetters chased, that 1980s celebrities flaunted, was now formally associated with danger to your very life. Few symbols in human history have travelled such a strange and complete circuit of meaning. So the tan reached the lowest point in its modern reputation, officially stamped as a genuine danger by the highest authorities, its glamorous machinery regulated and its image fundamentally rewritten. The carefree sun worship of earlier decades now looked not just outdated, but actively reckless, and protecting the skin had moved firmly from fussiness to good sense. The pendulum that had swung so dramatically from pale to bronze was now swinging back hard in the other direction, propelled by science, public health, and a hard-won understanding of what all that sunshine really cost. And so we arrive, after this long and dizzying voyage through the centuries, very nearly back where we started, with the sun once again recast as something to be managed, respected, and kept at a careful distance. And so, after this long and dizzying journey, we arrive right back where we started, more or less. Sun protection is now the genuine status symbol, with broad-brimmed hats, high-factor sunscreen, and carefully shaded skin signalling that you are informed, healthy and self-respecting rather than poor or idle. Glowing, untouched, well-protected skin is fashionable once more. And for those who still crave colour, the answer increasingly comes from a bottle or a spray booth rather than a burning afternoon outdoors. The parasol-wielding noblewoman and the modern beachgoer reaching for the sunscreen would, deep down, understand each other perfectly. The wheel has turned full circle, the sun is once again the enemy to be managed, and the only thing that never changes is our endless, slightly ridiculous willingness to suffer for the look of the moment. Look at how the markers of status have quietly rearranged themselves yet again. Today, the diligent application of high-factor sunscreen, the wide-brimmed hat, the careful avoidance of midday sun, all signal something admirable, that you're informed, health-conscious and thoughtful about your future. Where a deep tan once said success and savvy, it now can suggest carelessness, a failure to keep up with what everyone knows. Protected, well-cared-for skin has become the new badge of being on top of things, the look of a person who reads the research and acts on it. The privilege being advertised has shifted once more from leisure to knowledge, but the fundamental impulse to display your standing on your skin marches on exactly as it always has. The fashionable ideal has circled back toward the untouched and the luminous in a way that would feel oddly familiar to those long-ago pale obsessives, though the reasoning is now health rather than class. Glowing, clear, well-protected skin is widely prized, and the harsh, leathery, deeply baked look of earlier decades has lost much of its old appeal. For those who still want colour, the self-tanner and the spray booth have finally come into their own, vastly improved from their streaky orange-tinged origins, offering the bronze look without the ultraviolet cost. The tan, in other words, is increasingly something you wear rather than something you suffer for, a cosmetic effect detached at last from the dangerous sun that once produced it. There's a beautiful, almost cosmic symmetry in imagining the medieval noblewoman with her parasol standing beside the modern beachgoer, slathering on sunscreen, because for all the centuries between them, they're engaged in essentially the same act. Both are shielding their skin from the sun, both treating that great burning star as a threat to be carefully managed, both performing the rituals their society rewards. The noblewoman did it for status, and the modern beachgoer does it for health, but the gesture is identical. The wide hat and the shade and the determination not to let the sun have its way. They would understand each other instantly, two people separated by hundreds of years and united by a parasol hiding from the very same sky. And so we close the circle on one of the strangest, most revealing journeys in the history of human vanity, a 1,000-year roller coaster that took the simple colour of our skin and loaded it with meaning after contradictory meaning. Pale meant power, then weakness. Brown meant shame, then glamour, then danger. And through it all, the only true constant was our restless, relentless determination to read status into the surface of the body and to suffer cheerfully for whatever the current ideal demanded. We poisoned ourselves to be pale, we burned ourselves to be bronze, and now we shade ourselves once more, each generation utterly certain that its own standard was the obvious and timeless truth. It's a story that says less about the sun than it does about us, and about the lengths we'll always go to in order to belong. So here we are, at the end of our long and ludicrous voyage through the history of human skin and the meanings we've heaped upon it. Tonight you've watched noble women flee from sunbeams, queens paint themselves in poison, and fashionable people swallow arsenic to look a little more like a corpse. You've seen the whole world flip its mind, deciding that the very tan that once shamed a peasant was suddenly the glow of yachts and glamour, before science quietly cleared its throat and ruined the party for everyone. It is, when you lay it all out, gloriously absurd, the spectacle of generation after generation suffering cheerfully for a standard each one believed was the eternal, obvious truth. And yet there's something deeply human in all of it, something almost tender. These were people just like you, wanting to belong, wanting to be admired, wanting to wear their best self where the world could see it. They simply had fewer tools, harsher rules, and far more dangerous products than we do. They poisoned themselves out of ignorance, not foolishness, and they chased their ideals with the same stubborn hope that drives us still. They deserve our sympathy far more than our laughter, though a little laughter never hurts. So tonight, as you settle into your soft, safe bed, with no lead on your face and no arsenic in your medicine cabinet, maybe spare a quiet thought for all of them. For the lady sweating beneath her veils, the queen behind her cracking mask, the sunbather oiled and roasting on the sand, all of them just trying to look right for their moment in time. Be grateful for the small mercy of living in an age that finally bothered to read the warning label. Now let your shoulders sink, let your breathing slow, and let the long, strange story of the sun carry you gently off to sleep.